The CEO laughed at his handwritten blueprint. Until investors started a $40 M bidding war, there were 31 people in that conference room. 31. Angel investors, venture partners, 2 managing directors from firms that did not return emails from people like Ethan Marsh. They had come for the quarterly innovation showcase. They had come in tailored blazers and carrying the kind of silence that money produces in a room. Ethan came in last. He was wearing a canvas jacket with a paint stain on the left cuff that wasn't paint. He was carrying a cardboard tube and a paper folder that had been folded and unfolded enough times that the crease down the center had gone soft. Behind him, a 7-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat gripped a stuffed fox named Pepper with both hands. Pepper was orange and slightly flattened, as if he had been slept on for several consecutive years, which he had. The room went quiet in a particular way, the way a room does when something arrives that doesn't belong. Vivian Holt, CCO of Crest Innovations, said something under her breath to the man on her left. The man's name was Sterling Price. He smiled. He didn't bother to make it small. None of them knew that the rolled-up papers in that cardboard tube had already been reviewed by a patent examiner in Washington. None of them knew the number on the filing. None of them knew what was about to happen to the number in the bid documents sitting in the inboxes of 3 competing firms. Stay with this one. It builds to something none of them saw coming. The Crest Innovations Showcase happened 4 times a year in the top floor conference room of a building in the financial district that had been renovated so recently you could still smell the lacquer on the door frames. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, and a long oak table, and a screen at the far end, and a catering set up along the wall with items arranged in a way that communicated expense without announcing it. Vivian Holt ran the showcases herself. She was 32 years old. She had been CEO for 16 months, appointed from within after a board vote that had not been unanimous. She was smart. She had good instincts about markets and positioning. She worked 7 days a week with a consistency that impressed the people who worked for her and quietly exhausted the ones who loved her. She had inherited a company that was profitable but not growing, and had spent 16 months trying to change that, and she was starting to feel the particular weight of a person who has been pushing something uphill for a long time, without knowing how close the top is. Sterling Price was her senior director of strategy. He was 44 years old and had the handshake of a man who had practiced it. He had been at Crest for 9 years, through 3 CEO transitions, and he had a talent for being present at the right meetings and absent from the right disasters. He curated the showcase invite list. He had curated this one. He had also been the one to receive Ethan's application. Ethan had submitted it 6 weeks earlier through the company's open innovation portal, a form on the website that Crest used to signal openness to outside ideas without actually being required to engage with them. The portal's submissions went to a shared inbox that Sterling's team monitored. The form asked for a concept summary, a development stage, and contact information. Ethan had submitted a 2-page summary of a thermal transfer system for modular construction, a design that could reduce the energy load of a mid-sized building by between 31 and 38%, depending on the envelope, without structural modification. He had attached 3 pages of hand-drawn diagrams. Sterling had read the summary. He had looked at the diagrams. He had put the application in a folder he had labeled miscellaneous. Unsolicited. He had not replied. Then, 4 weeks later, the same diagrams had turned up in a patent filing reviewed by a colleague at a competing firm. The colleague had mentioned it offhandedly at an industry dinner. Sterling had smiled and nodded, and excused himself to make a phone call. He had called Vivian and said there was an outside applicant worth including in the showcase. He had framed it as due diligence. He had not mentioned that he already knew about the filing. He had not mentioned that he had dismissed the application weeks earlier without flagging. He had arranged for Ethan to be placed last on the agenda. He had told Vivian, privately, not to expect much. Ethan Marsh was 33 years old. He had the kind of face that defaulted to serious. Not unfriendly, just calibrated toward the real. He had a daughter named Isla, who was 7, and who had recently decided that Pepper the Fox was most secure when carried with both hands rather than, 1, a refinement she had arrived at independently and with conviction. He had a toolbox in the back of his car, and a subscription to 3 different materials science journals, and a rented workspace in a shared building on the east side of the city where the heating worked inconsistently. And the coffee machine in the common area had been broken for 4 months, and nobody had fixed it, and he had been meaning to look at it, but had not yet had time. His wife, Dara, had died 2 years ago, a cardiac event that happened without warning and ended the same way, and there had been no time to prepare for it, because that is the nature of a thing that happens without warning. Isla had been 5. She had asked questions about it that Ethan had answered as honestly as he could, which was not as honestly as he wished, because there are some things you answer with what you know, and some things you answer with what you hope, and some things you answer by sitting on the edge of the bed and keeping your hand on the small of her back until her breathing slows. She still slept with Pepper every night. She brought Pepper to appointments and errands, and, on certain days, to the shared workspace, where she sat at a folding table with her notebook and drew with a seriousness that the other people in the building found either charming or unsettling depending on how much coffee they'd had. On the morning of the Crest showcase, Ethan had made her toast. She had eaten half of it. He had tied her left shoe twice because the bow kept going uneven. She had looked at him while he was doing it with the patience of someone who has decided to allow this. He had put the diagrams in their tube. He had put the supporting documentation in the folder. He had put Pepper into her hands and held the door. The first 5 presenters at the showcase were excellent, in the way showcase presenters are often excellent, polished, specific, confident about their addressable market. Vivian asked good questions. Sterling took notes and nodded with the focused expression of someone doing a performance of listening. Ethan sat at the far end of the table with Isla beside him. Isla had Pepper on the table in front of her, facing the screen, and she was drawing in her notebook in the careful, methodical way she drew, her tongue pressed to her top lip. When the 5th presenter finished, Sterling introduced Ethan with the particular brevity of a man who has already decided how something will go. He said, "Our final presenter is Ethan Marsh, independent developer. He has a concept in thermal systems, Ethan." Ethan stood. He uncapped the cardboard tube. He removed the diagrams. They were drawn in pencil and ink on large format drafting paper, the kind that comes in a roll, and he unfolded them on the table with the particular care of a man who has looked at these lines 10,000 times and still checks their placement. The diagrams were beautiful in the way technical drawings are beautiful when the person who made them understood what they were drawing. Precise, clean, the annotations written in a small, deliberate hand along the margins. Vivian looked at them. She looked at Sterling. Sterling's face said something without saying it. She said politely, "This is handwritten." Ethan said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have a digital version?" He said, "I can produce one." The filings are already digital. Something about the word filings did something to the air in the room. It was brief. It passed. Vivian looked at the room. The investors were courteous. Sterling was smiling with the lower half of his face. She said, "Why don't you walk us through the concept?" He did. He spoke for 9 minutes. He used a pencil to trace the elements of the design on the drawings as he talked, his hand moving without hesitation, pointing to each component with the easy familiarity of a person who has built the thing in their mind 10,000 times before putting it on paper. He talked about thermal bridging and passive transfer rates and the specific modular interface that made retrofitting possible without structural intervention. He gave 4 numbers: cost per unit, projected energy reduction, installation window, and net saving over a 10-year cycle for a mid-sized commercial property. The number in the second-to-last position was 31 to 38%. He said it without emphasis. The woman at the far end of the table, Margot Fenley, managing director at a firm called Ardent Capital, who had attended these showcases for 3 years, and who had the particular stillness of someone who hears a great deal and responds to very little, put down her pen. She looked at the diagram. She looked at Ethan. She said nothing. But she had stopped doing everything else. Sterling spoke before the room could breathe. He said that the concept was interesting and that the team would follow up with all presenters in the standard window, and that Crest valued outside innovation and that they appreciated everyone's time. He said it the way a door closes, firmly, without drama, in a way that suggests the conversation is over. The room began to shift. People stood. Business cards appeared. Ethan was rolling the diagrams back into the tube when Margot Fenley walked to the end of the table and stood beside him. She was not the kind of person who rushed to the end of a table. She had not done it in the 3 years of showcases before this one. She said, quietly, "Is the filing public?" He said, "The provisional is. The full application was accepted 8 weeks ago." She said, "Who's your representation?" He said a name. A patent attorney in the building where he worked, a sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who had been doing IP work for 20 years, and who charged him in installments, because she had known Dara, and because she believed in the design. Margot took a card from her jacket pocket and held it out. She said, "Call me before the end of the week." She walked back to the main group. Her face gave nothing away. Ethan put the card in his jacket pocket beside his pen. He looked at Isla. She had drawn the room, the long table, the windows, the people standing in small groups. In the drawing, she had put Pepper at the head of the table. He almost said something. He didn't. He put the tube under his arm. He took Isla's hand. They walked out. Sterling watched them go with the expression of a man who has closed a door and is confident it will stay closed. 3 days earlier, a conversation had taken place in a building 6 blocks away that Sterling did not know about. Ardent Capital had been running a quiet evaluation of thermal efficiency innovations for commercial real estate for 11 months. The evaluation had been triggered by a portfolio problem. 3 of their real estate holdings were facing tightened energy compliance requirements in 18 months, and the retrofit costs under conventional approaches were significant enough to affect returns. They had been looking for something that worked differently. Their internal research team had flagged Ethan's patent application during a routine filing scan 5 weeks before the showcase. They had sent a junior associate to find out who Ethan Marsh was. The associate had come back with a summary that included the shared workspace, the toolbox, the broken coffee machine, and a note that said, "The inventor does not appear to have representation beyond a single IP attorney and has not been approached by any firm." Margot had read the summary. She had waited. She had learned, over a career that spanned 2 recessions and 1 market collapse, that timing is not about speed. It is about knowing when a room is ready. The showcase had made the room ready. She called Ethan on Thursday morning. He was at the shared workspace. Isla was at school. Pepper was on the folding table beside his materials journals, the way Isla left him when she was not there, positioned, watching, as if maintaining something. He answered on the second ring. Margot said, "I'd like to arrange a meeting with you and Ruth. I have a number in mind, and I want to know if it's in the right territory before we go further." He said, "All right." She said the number. He was quiet for a moment, not a short moment. The particular silence of a person recalibrating. He said, "I'll call Ruth." Ruth called Vivian Holt's office at 11:15 on Friday morning. She identified herself. She said that she represented Ethan Marsh and that there was an interest from a third party in the thermal transfer IP that had been presented at the Crest showcase. She said specifically that the interest was significant and that she was extending the courtesy of a first-look window to Crest before any further process began. She said the window was 48 hours. Vivian took the call standing at her desk. She listened. She said she would be in touch. She pressed the intercom. She asked Sterling to come in. He came in. He sat down. She described the call. Something happened to Sterling's face. It was fast. It was the expression of a man who has been standing in front of a door he locked, watching someone approach with a key. He said, "The application is probably narrow. The technology has limitations we identified in the review." She said, "What review?" He said, "The internal review." When his materials came in. She said, "When did his materials come in?" He said, "Through the portal, 6 weeks ago." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You received his application 6 weeks ago." He said, "Through the unsolicited channel." She said, "And you decided not to flag it." He said nothing. She picked up the phone. She called her head of technical evaluation, a quiet, precise woman named Adeze, who had a background in building physics and who had been at Crest for 3 years and who had looked at the showcase diagrams over the weekend, because she did that with all the showcase materials, and had sent Vivian a 2-paragraph email on Sunday night that Vivian had not yet read. She pulled up the email now. The first paragraph said that the thermal transfer mechanism in the Marsh application was not incremental. The second paragraph used the phrase category defining twice and said it without apology. Vivian read it once. She looked at Sterling. He said, "I can explain the categorization decision." She said, "Get Ruth's number from the call log." What happened over the following 31 hours was the kind of thing that happens when a room that has been keeping a secret realizes the secret is already outside. Margot Fenley's inquiry had not been the only one. A firm called Veritas Capital had flagged the patent filing independently. A real estate development group out of Chicago with 3 mixed-use projects under compliance review had been put in contact with Ruth by a consultant who had seen the filing and connected the dots. By Saturday morning, Ruth had 4 inquiries on her desk and 1 formal letter of intent. She called Ethan at 7:43 in the morning. He was making Isla's breakfast. He had the phone between his ear and his shoulder. He was holding a spatula. She said the number that was in the letter of intent. He set the spatula down on the counter. He stood in the kitchen in the quiet of a Saturday morning, and he looked at the refrigerator. There was a drawing taped to it that Isla had made. A fox, a house, a man with a spatula, a sun with careful rays. The drawing had been there for 2 months. He had straightened it once when it went crooked, and had not moved it since. He said, "What's the ceiling?" Ruth said, "I don't think we've found it yet." He was quiet. He looked at the drawing. He said, "What does this mean for the design, for how it gets used?" She said, "That's a licensing and terms conversation. You control that. That's what I'm here for." He said, "Okay." He picked up the spatula. The eggs were starting to catch on one side. He turned them. Isla came into the kitchen with Pepper under her arm, her hair pressed flat on one side from sleeping. She looked at him. She looked at the phone. She looked at the eggs. She said, "Are those going to be okay?" He said, "Yeah." She sat at the table. She put Pepper on the chair beside her, facing the table, and she pulled her notebook toward her. She began to draw. Vivian Holt called Ruth on Saturday afternoon. She did not use an intermediary. She called directly, and she spoke without preamble, which was how she operated when she had decided something. She said, I want to understand what Crest would need to provide to be competitive here. Ruth said, I need a number from you, and I need a terms framework. I need it by Monday morning. Vivian said, You'll have it Sunday night. Ruth said, I also need to know that Ethan will have a seat at the table on development and application. This is not a rights transfer where he disappears. That's a condition. Vivian said, I understand. She hung up. She sat at her desk in her home office. It was late afternoon. The light through the window was the low autumn light that makes rooms feel more particular, more specific, more like themselves. She opened a new document. She typed a number. She thought about it. She revised it. Then she called Sterling. He answered on the third ring. She said, I've spoken to counsel. The IP portal intake process will be reviewed. I need you to understand what that review will find, he said. Vivienne, she said, I need you to understand what it will find, Sterling, so that you can decide how you'd like to proceed before Monday. A long silence. He said, What are you asking me to do? She said, I'm asking you to think carefully about whether you want to be the person who explains that decision, or whether you want to get ahead of it. She did not say anything else. She ended the call. Sterling looked at his phone for a long time. He looked at his office, the framed articles, the awards from industry dinners, the view of the city he had worked 11 years to occupy. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he opened his laptop. He drafted an email to Vivienne. It took him 4 attempts to write it. The final version was 9 sentences. The last sentence said, I believe it is in the best interest of both Crest and the inventor for me to step aside from any role in this process. He sent it at 9:14 in the evening. He closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet of his office and he looked at the view. On Monday morning, Vivienne arrived at the Crest building at 7:30. She rode the elevator to the top floor. She walked into the conference room where the showcase had been held 4 days earlier. She stood at the window and looked at the city. At 8 o'clock, Ethan arrived. He was wearing the same canvas jacket. He had Isla with him because it was a school holiday, and he had not arranged otherwise, and he had told Vivian this when she confirmed the meeting time, and she had said it was fine. Isla was carrying Pepper, as she did, one-handed now, a recent revision. Ruth arrived 2 minutes later. Adaze was already in the room. Margot Fenley was participating by phone. Vivienne was the one who laid the documents on the table. She laid them herself, not Sterling, who was not there, whose office was being reviewed by HR, and whose responsibilities had been redistributed in an email sent Sunday evening to the senior team. She laid the bid framework, the terms sheet, the attribution and involvement clauses that Ruth had asked for, the number. The number was not the same as the letter of intent from Saturday. It was larger. Ruth looked at it. She looked at Ethan. She said, We'll need the morning. Vivian said, Take what you need. She looked at Isla, who had found a chair near the window and arranged Pepper on the armrest and opened her notebook. The same chair, Vivienne realized, as the one she had occupied during the showcase. The same window, the same view. Vivienne crossed the room and stood at the window looking out. After a moment, she said to Ethan, I owe you an apology. He looked at her. She said, What happened with your application? The way it was handled when it came through the portal? That should not have happened. I didn't know about it when it happened. But that doesn't make it not my responsibility. I was wrong to let a process exist that could swallow something like this without it ever reaching my desk. She looked at the window. I'm sorry. Not for what I didn't know, for what I should have had in place. It was quiet. The particular quiet of a room where someone has said a true thing and let it stand. Ethan said, The design still works the same way it did before any of this. Vivian looked at him. Something in her face settled. The way a building settles when the foundation is properly set. The relief of a person who has apologized specifically and been met with something. That is not forgiveness exactly, but is something real, she said. I know. Isla looked up from her notebook. She looked at the two of them. She looked at Pepper on the armrest. She said, in the clear, unornamented way she said everything, "Pepper says the house is going to be warmer now." Nobody laughed. Not because it wasn't the right response, but because the room understood, in the way rooms sometimes understand things without discussing them, that she was right. The final terms were agreed by 1:15 in the afternoon. Ethan and Ruth were there for all of it. Ethan had conditions, 3 of them. His name on the design in every application. A seat at the table for every major deployment decision. A licensing structure that allowed his work to be used in affordable housing projects at cost. Ruth had drafted the 3rd condition. He had added it himself. At 2:15, Ethan came down from the Crest building into the afternoon. The city was doing what it does in late autumn. The sky the color of old pewter. The air carrying the specific weight of the season turning. People moved on the sidewalk with their coats half-zipped and their heads down. Isla walked beside him with Pepper in the crook of her arm now, a 3rd variation which he had noticed and not mentioned. She put her hand in his. They walked the 2 blocks to where the car was parked. He opened the back door for her. She climbed in. He buckled her in. He straightened Pepper, who had gone sideways in the process. He stood at the side of the car for a moment in the gray afternoon, hand on the door, looking back at the building, at the top floor windows, at the light behind them. He got in. Isla was looking at him in the rearview mirror with her mother's expression, the one that asked questions, without asking them. He said, "You hungry?" She said,
Is Pep hungry?
He said, "Probably." She considered this. She looked at Pepper, consulted something he couldn't hear. Then she turned back to the window. He pulled out into the street. The lights were going amber down the avenue, block by block, the way they did this time of day. He drove through them in no hurry, both hands on the wheel, the cardboard tube on the back seat beside Isla, its contents still rolled, the lines still precise, the annotations in his small, careful hand still reading exactly as he had intended. He drove home to make dinner.